Harlem, 1964. The waning days of autumn cast a cool gray light over Manhattan, and a hint of winter hung in the air. Inside an upscale department store on the Upper East Side, the atmosphere was warm and opulent, polished marble floors, crystal chandeliers glinting softly, and racks of fine clothing and rolls of expensive fabric arranged with artistic care. The store catered to the city's elite, those accustomed to tailored suits from Italy and silk dresses from Paris. On this afternoon, a well-dressed black family stepped inside, immediately drawing curious glances from the mostly white clientele and sales staff. Ellsworth. Bumpy. Johnson walked slightly ahead of his wife and daughter, his posture upright and confident. At 59 years old, Bumpy carried himself with the quiet authority of a man who had little to prove to anyone. He was of medium height, solidly built, with a neatly trimmed mustache and keen eyes behind tinted glasses. He wore a tailored charcoal gray suit and a matching fedora, the very picture of Harlem's sophistication meets underworld power. Beside him was his wife, Mamie, elegant in a navy blue day dress and pearls. Mamie Hatcher Johnson exuded grace. She had the bearing of a schoolteacher or a lady of society. In truth, she was both educated and streetwise, the backbone of Bumpy's personal life. On Mamie's arm was their daughter Ruthie, a pretty teenager with her mother's refined features. Ruthie's eyes sparkled as she took in the lavish displays. She especially loved the rolls of vibrant cloth in the dressmaking section they were entering. Bumpy had promised to buy fabric for a custom gown for Ruthie's school recital, and Mamie perhaps had her eye on some new drapes or upholstery. As they strolled deeper into the store, a silence of sorts followed them, the soft hush that falls when people pause conversations to observe newcomers. It wasn't common in 1964 to see a black family shopping in this bastion of luxury. Despite the Civil Rights Act having passed that summer, social norms were slower to change. Some of the white patrons eyed the Johnsons with open curiosity, a few with thinly veiled disdain. But Bumpy, Mamie, and Ruthie carried on as if oblivious, heads held high. They had every right to be here, and they knew it. A young saleswoman approached with a practiced smile. "Good afternoon. May I help you find something?" Her tone was polite, if a tad uncertain. Mamie returned the smile warmly. "We're interested in dress fabrics today. Something high quality, perhaps silk or fine satin. My daughter has a recital coming up." Her diction was clear and cultured. She could have been a professor or a patron of the arts. The saleswoman seemed slightly surprised at Mamie's refinement, but nodded and led them toward a section with bolts of imported fabric. Bumpy trailed just behind, one hand resting protectively at the small of Ruthie's back. He noted the other shoppers still glancing their way. In his younger years, his temper might have flared at those looks. Now he maintained a cool exterior. Let them stare, he thought. He was here for his family. Besides, he had dealt with far worse than snooty looks. At a counter near the back, the saleswoman began laying out a few fabric options, a rich emerald green satin, a deep red brocade, across the top for Mamie and Ruthie to feel. Ruthie's face lit up at the vibrant colors. "Oh, Mama, this one's lovely," she said softly, running a hand over the satin. Her voice was gentle and educated, a reflection of the private schooling Bumpy paid for. Mamie held the satin up to Ruthie's shoulder, imagining the gown. "It's beautiful, and the color would suit you." She turned to the saleswoman. "Do you have this in a royal blue? By chance?" That's her favorite color. As the saleswoman went to check, Bumpy stood by patiently. He wasn't a man who particularly enjoyed shopping for fabrics. But seeing his daughter's excitement made him content. It was a normal family outing, a rare slice of ordinary life he relished, given the chaos that often surrounded his profession. While they waited, Bumpy became aware of a figure hovering a few yards away. The store manager, Mr. Herbert Wilson, had positioned himself behind a nearby display, pretending to sort some inventory while casting surreptitious glances at the Johnsons. Wilson was a stout, balding man in a pinstriped suit. He had the air of someone who lorded over this domain for decades. To him, everything in this store, merchandise and clientele alike, needed to meet his standards. And from the tightening of his lips, it was clear the presence of a black family did not meet those standards. Bumpy noticed the manager whisper something to one of his employees, a floor walker, who then glanced at the Johnsons. The employee looked uneasy and did not approach, perhaps unwilling to confront paying customers who were doing nothing wrong. Bumpy kept this in his peripheral awareness, saying nothing to Mamie or Ruthie. He simply placed a reassuring hand on Mamie's shoulder as she and Ruthie discussed fabric textures. The saleswoman returned with a bolt of royal blue satin, struggling slightly under its weight. Immediately, Ruthie's eyes shone. "Oh, that's perfect!" she exclaimed softly. Mamie thanked the clerk, and they began discussing how many yards they would need. Ruthie was about to twirl a length of the fabric in front of a mirror when a new voice intruded, sharp and condescending. "Is there a problem here?" The store manager, Wilson, had decided to step in. He approached the counter with a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. The saleswoman looked startled by his sudden presence. Mamie raised an eyebrow. No problem at all. This young lady has been very helpful." A Wilson's gaze swept over Mamie and Ruthie, then fixed on Bumpy, as though identifying the father, the decision maker. "Sir?" Wilson addressed Bumpy with forced civility. "These are quite expensive fabrics. Perhaps I can direct you to a different section. Something more in line with your needs." Bumpy heard what went unsaid. His jaw tightened slightly. "Our needs are just fine right here," he replied evenly. His voice was polite but carried an undercurrent of warning, too subtle for those who didn't know him, but enough to make the saleswoman step back. She sensed tension crackling in the air. Wilson's smile thinned. He was not a man used to being challenged in his store. "These materials run at 40 a yard and up," he said, his tone cool. "That was a high price, but not beyond what many customers here paid." He added pointedly, "Perhaps you'd prefer the bargain fabrics on the ground floor." Ruthie's face fell. She understood the insult implied, that they couldn't afford this, that they didn't belong here. Mamie's cheeks flushed with anger, but she maintained her poise. "We came here specifically for quality fabric." "Money is not an issue," Mamie said, each word measured. Bumpy's hand lightly touched Ruthie's shoulder, a silent comfort. He fixed Mr. Wilson with a steady stare. "We appreciate your concern," Bumpy said in a low voice, "but my wife has excellent taste, and I intend to purchase whatever she likes. At full price." A couple of nearby shoppers were now openly watching, sensing an incident brewing. The saleswoman nervously fidgeted with the fabric bolt, not sure whether to continue or step away. Wilson's nostrils flared. He likely prided himself on being courteous to paying customers, but prejudice was outweighing sense in this moment. Still, he tried one more tactful approach. "Sir, perhaps I should verify. Do you have an account with us? Or would you be paying in cash?" The insinuation was clear. He doubted they had the means or credit to shop here. Bumpy gave a thin smile. "Cash. I find it's always accepted." He reached into his coat and, in a deliberate show, pulled out a money clip thick with bills. Right on top were several $100 bills. Wilson's eyes flickered to the cash. For a second, his expression registered surprise. Mamie felt a surge of satisfaction. She almost wanted to smirk at the man's astonishment, but she restrained herself. Ruthie pressed closer to her father, uneasy with the confrontation but comforted by his confidence. The manager cleared his throat. "Very well." He glanced at the saleswoman. "Finish up with, 'these people,' then." His phrasing, "these people," dripped with disdain. He turned sharply as if to leave. And then it happened. Perhaps it was the slight smirk on Ruthie's face at seeing her father shut him down, or simply the accumulation of his own bias and irritation, but Mr. Wilson pivoted back, unable to resist the last word. On second thought, he said loudly, "I must ask you to leave. Now, I've seen your type come in before, prowling, touching everything, making a mess. I don't know what kind of stunt you think you're pulling, but this store doesn't need your money or your kind. We don't serve Harlem trash here." He practically spat the last words. For an instant, time stopped. The hush in the store was absolute. Mamie's face went ashen. She inhaled sharply as if slapped. Ruthie's eyes widened in pure hurt and embarrassment, a tear springing up despite her attempt to blink it away. The saleswoman gasped, "Sir," clearly shocked her boss would be so blatantly bigoted and unprofessional. A couple of customers murmured in disapproval at the overt slur, while others looked away, uncomfortable but saying nothing. Bumpy Johnson did not move. He stood utterly still, as if carved from stone. Only those closest could see the change in his eyes, a fire igniting behind the dark lenses of his glasses. His right hand, still resting on Ruthie's shoulder, tightened a fraction. Ruthie felt it, and it steadied her somehow, reminding her father was there. Mr. Wilson's chest heaved with righteous indignation, as if he believed his insult was his duty to uphold the store's sanctity. In his mind, perhaps he'd shown courage by ejecting undesirable trash. A Bumpy slowly removed his glasses, folding them deliberately, and tucked them into his breast pocket. His eyes on Wilson were calm, cold. When he finally spoke, his voice was almost soft, but it carried to every ear nearby. "My family and I," he said, "we're just leaving." For a brief second, something in Bumpy's gaze made the manager step back instinctively. In those eyes was a promise of reckoning that the manager was unequipped to read fully, but he felt a chill. Still, Wilson straightened, waving a hand peremptorily towards the exit as if shooing away strays. Mamie put a hand on Bumpy's arm. "Ellsworth, let's go," she said quietly, using his given name. There was a tremble in her voice, anger held in check by urgency. She feared what he might do if provoked further. She knew that deadly calm of his. Bumpy turned to his wife and daughter. Seeing Ruthie's tear and Mamie's humiliated stance was perhaps the hardest moment for him. His heart pounded in his ears, but he nodded. "Come on, baby," he gently said to Ruthie, wiping the single tear off her cheek with his thumb. Ruthie swallowed and nodded, trusting her father. He picked up the bolt of royal blue fabric from the counter, the very item they intended to buy, and draped it carefully over the arm of the stunned saleswoman. In a courteous tone, Bumpy said, "Thank you for your help, miss. Sorry we won't be completing the purchase today." The saleswoman looked miserable. "I'm so sorry, sir," she began, but Bumpy gave a nearly imperceptible shake of his head. It wasn't her fault, and he had no quarrel with her. With that, Bumpy placed a firm hand on Mamie's lower back and guided his family away. They walked out of that glittering store as regally as they had entered, heads high, refusing to give Mr. Wilson the satisfaction of seeing them argue or break down. The manager watched them leave with a dismissive sneer, feeling victorious in his twisted way. The moment the heavy glass doors shut behind the Johnsons, Bumpy's jaw clenched so tight it ached. He inhaled a long breath of the chilly air. For Ruthie's sake, he forced a small smile. "We'll find something even better, Pumpkin. Don't you worry." Ruthie nodded, though her lip trembled. She had never been called trash before, certainly not in such a public, degrading manner. Mamie wrapped an arm around her daughter, pulling her close as they walked to the curb. The driver of Bumpy's parked Cadillac, a young man named Clarence, saw them coming and leapt out to open the rear door. Inside the privacy of the car, Mamie's composure cracked. "The nerve of that man," she hissed, fury and hurt shining in her eyes. "In this day and age, calling us trash! As if we'd steal something, as if we don't belong anywhere we please." She was shaking with indignation. Ruthie sniffled, leaning into her mother. "Mama, why would he say that? We didn't do anything." A Bumpy sat opposite them in the limousine-style back seat, which had a facing bench. His hands were clasped tightly, knuckles pale. It took him a few seconds to respond, and when he did his tone was measured, for his daughter's sake. "Because some people are hateful, Ruthie. They judge others by color and nothing else. It's ignorance." The effort to keep his voice gentle was enormous, like holding back a hurricane behind a paper dam. Mamie looked at her husband's face. She knew that look, eyes distant, calculating like a predator locking onto prey. He appeared calm to an outsider, but inside he had to be boiling. She reached over and placed a hand on top of his clenched fists. "Ellsworth, just let it be. Please?" Her voice was soft, pleading. Bumpy turned his hand over to squeeze hers briefly. "You know I can't do that," he said under his breath, so Ruthie wouldn't hear. Mamie closed her eyes. She did know. And part of her even felt he shouldn't let it be. The insult burned in her soul. But she was afraid of the consequences if Bumpy acted on his rage. They had a life to protect, a daughter, a home, everything they had built. Clarence shut the car door and returned to the driver's seat. He glanced in the rear view mirror, noticing the tension, and wisely kept quiet as he pulled the car into traffic. For a few minutes, they rode in silence through Manhattan. The city's noises, honking horns, the rumble of buses were muffled in the insulated luxury vehicle. Ruthie wiped her eyes, trying to regain her composure. She had seen her father angry before, but usually at others in his world of gangsters, never like this. She leaned her head against Mamie. "I'm okay," she whispered, as if to convince them all. Bumpy exchanged a look with Mamie. Without words, they communicated, "We'll talk later." For now, Bumpy put on a different face. He smiled gently at Ruthie. "How about we stop by that candy store you like on the way home? Get you some fudge." Ruthie managed a small smile. "That would be nice, Daddy. Thank you." True to his word, Bumpy had Clarence pull over at a famous old-fashioned candy shop near 125th Street once they returned to Harlem. Bumpy stepped out to buy Ruthie's favorite sweets. It was a brief, sweet distraction, the girl's spirits lifted slightly by the simple treat. Mamie watched her husband through the store window as he chatted kindly with the elderly candy store owner. The juxtaposition struck her here was the kind, generous man who could charm old shopkeepers and spoil his daughter, and within him too was the enraged gangster who might be plotting violence at that very moment. When they finally reached home, a spacious, tastefully furnished apartment on West 139th Street, Ruthie seemed tired. Mamie suggested she go lie down for a bit or practice her recital piece to take her mind off things. Grateful to retreat to normalcy, Ruthie headed to her room with her bag of fudge, leaving her parents alone in the living room. It was an elegant room, with well-chosen art on the walls and shelves of books that Mamie loved. As soon as Ruthie's door clicked shut, Mamie turned to Bumpy, her eyes flashing. "All right, Ellsworth, tell me what you're planning to do." Bumpy had been standing by the window, staring out at the late afternoon light slanting over Harlem's rooftops. At his wife's direct question, he sighed. "What I have to," he replied quietly, still looking outside. Mamie crossed the room and gently shut the door to Ruthie's room to be sure she wouldn't hear. "That man was vile, I agree. He deserved something. But think carefully. The last thing we need is you going to war with some department store and getting into trouble with the law again. We've been fortunate since you came home from Alcatraz. Don't jeopardize that over a fool's words." Bumpy turned to face her. The late day sun highlighted a scar on his chin, a souvenir from a knife fight long ago. His expression was resolute. "You want me to just swallow it, Mamie? Pretend it didn't happen. He made our daughter cry." His voice hardened on the last sentence, and his hand curled involuntarily, as if imagining it around the manager's throat. "I want you to be smart," Mamie countered. "We have enough people gunning for you all the time. The police still trail you, others want to bring you down. We don't need to create a new incident, especially one outside of Harlem where you have fewer friends in high places." Bumpy stepped closer and took Mamie's hands in his. "Listen," he said softly. "I know you're worried. And you're right, I'll be careful. But I'm not letting that slide. It's not just about me or even you. It's about what's right. Men like that, they think they can do anything to us, say anything, because there's no consequence. Well, he's going to face a consequence." Mamie searched his face. There was love there, and anger, and a sense of duty that was almost moral in its own twisted way. She knew she couldn't dissuade him. Bumpy's mind was set. "At least promise me you won't kill him," she whispered. She hated that they even had to have such a conversation, but this was their reality. Bumpy nodded. "I'm not going to kill him. That would bring more heat than he's worth. I just want to teach him. He'll live, but he'll remember." The coldness in his eyes, as he said that last line, actually made a shiver run down Mamie's spine. After a moment, she squeezed his hands and let them go. "Fine. I can't stop you. Just come back to me. We've been apart too many years already." Her voice cracked slightly, a reference to the 11 years he spent in prison, away from her. Bumpy's expression softened. He gently stroked her cheek. "I'll always come back to you, Mamie." He kissed her forehead. "Now, I need to make some calls. I'll be in the study." Mamie nodded, swallowing her anxiety. She watched as Bumpy walked down the hall to his small office, shoulders squared, purpose in his stride. Once he disappeared inside and closed the door, she sank onto the sofa, heart pounding with a mix of residual anger and fear for what was to come. Behind the closed door of his study, Bumpy moved with efficient determination. This room was his inner sanctum, a heavy oak desk, a row of filing cabinets, and a safe, and on the wall a map of Harlem with pins marking various businesses and operations under his influence. Above the desk hung a framed photograph of him with Billie Holiday and Sugar Ray Robinson at a charity event years ago, a reminder that he mingled with society's elite even as he ruled the underworld. He picked up the phone and dialed a number from memory. After 2 rings, a male voice answered cautiously. "Hello." "It's Bumpy," he said curtly. "I need a favor." Bobby. A Bobby was one of his lieutenants, a reliable fellow in his 40s who managed some of Bumpy's numbers racket and occasionally handled special tasks. "Sure thing, boss." "What do you need?" A Bumpy glanced at the closed door, ensuring privacy. "I need information on a man. Herbert Wilson. He's the manager of Happy," gave a brief description of the store and its address. "Find out where he lives, what time the store closes, if he's usually alone after closing, any security measures there. And I need it soon by tonight." Bobby didn't miss a beat. "Got it. I know that place. It's upscale. Want me to come by later with the info?" "Yes. Come by around 9. Use the back alley entrance," Bumpy instructed. That was his standard method to avoid unwanted eyes. "You got it, Bump," Bobby affirmed. He hesitated, then, "This guy give you trouble?" Bumpy's voice went ice cold. "He insulted my family. That's all you need to know?" On the line, Bobby fell silent for half a second. He'd known Bumpy long enough to grasp the subtext. "Understood. I'll be there at 9. A Bumpy hung up. He took a slow breath, steadying the fury coiled within him. The memory of that word, trash, echoed in his head, fueling him. In his mind, he saw again Mamie's stricken face and Ruthie's tear. It made his blood boil and yet sharpened his focus. He went to the safe in the corner and unlocked it. Inside, among stacks of cash and documents, were a few firearms. He selected a small revolver, something easily concealed. He checked the cylinder, fully loaded. Bumpy wasn't planning to shoot Mr. Wilson, but he would carry the gun for insurance. Fear tended to make people unpredictable, and he wasn't going to be caught off guard if Wilson or anyone else tried something foolish. As he laid the gun on his desk, his gaze drifted to a particular item on a side shelf, a pricing tag gun he had taken as a memento years ago from a store in Harlem. It looked like a device that Price marked items by pressing a trigger to drive a thin nail or thick pin through a tag and into merchandise. It was an older model, heavy duty, from the 1950s, painted red. Bumpy picked it up thoughtfully. A memory surfaced, unbidden years ago. Back in the late 1940s, Bumpy's own mother, Margaret, had been harassed by a shop clerk on 125th Street. The clerk had sold her spoiled milk, and when Margaret returned to complain, he called her a nigger and told her to get out. When Bumpy found out, he was livid. He walked right into that grocery, confronted the clerk, and when the man sneered and repeated the slur, Bumpy had grabbed a Price labeling hammer and struck the man across the face with it. The impact shattered the clerk's cheekbone and knocked out 2 teeth. Bumpy didn't kill him. He had simply said, "That's what you get for talking to a lady like that," and left the man groaning on the floor. Harlem's folk had quietly cheered that day. Word spread that Bumpy Johnson made the grocer eat his own rotten merchandise, a slight embellishment in the retelling. And from then on, every grocer in the neighborhood treated his black customers with a little more care, knowing Bumpy was watching. Now, holding the tagging gun, Bumpy mused on how history rhymed. Another bigot, another Price, tagging device conveniently at hand. A cruel idea sparked in his mind. To mark a man with the tools of his trade, he flexed his hand around the handle and pulled the trigger experimentally. Click. The mechanism was still sound. This could do. This would certainly do. He set the tool down. There was time before Bobby would arrive with details. Bumpy used it to prepare mentally. He poured himself a 2-finger measure of bourbon from a decanter, sat in his leather chair, and let his mind run through tomorrow's planned events carefully. He would confront Mr. Wilson after the store closed tomorrow, Saturday. Saturdays the store likely closed at 6 p.m., maybe later during holiday season, but given it was only November, it should be 6. Wilson probably stayed a while to handle closing paperwork. Security. Perhaps a guard, or just the manager and a cleaner. Bobby's intel would clarify. Bumpy figured at worst a guard, likely an older man or off-duty cop, but that person could be bribed or threatened to stand down. Or Bumpy could simply wait until Wilson stepped outside. But doing it inside the store had a poetic justice to it, in the very sanctum where the offense occurred. He considered bringing more men, but decided against it. Too many people increased risk of things going wrong or someone blabbing later. Better to keep it small and controlled. He trusted Bobby and perhaps one more of his crew if needed for backup, but he himself would handle Wilson. This was personal. As he sipped the bourbon, Bumpy's thoughts wandered to that infamous meeting with Dutch Schultz back in 35 at the Cotton Club, another time he'd been openly disrespected. Dutch, a white gangster, had called him boy, and far worse in front of a crowd. Bumpy had, that night, delivered an ultimatum instead of reacting violently on the spot. Within a week, Dutch's men were dropping dead one by one until Schultz pulled out of Harlem entirely. Bumpy had orchestrated that masterfully, making a point about respect that the underworld never forgot. He smirked at the memory. Schultz learned too late that you never publicly humiliate a man like Bumpy Johnson and walk away unscathed. Now Mr. Herbert Wilson, a nobody outside of his fancy store, was about to learn a similar lesson, tailored just for him. Bumpy cracked his knuckles, the anger coiling tight in his chest, but tempered by the knowledge that soon it would be released. 7:30 tomorrow, Herbert, he murmured to himself, picturing the manager's face. We'll see if you're still laughing then. At dinner that evening, Bumpy was quieter than usual, but polite and present. Ruthie had recovered her spirits somewhat and chattered about her upcoming piano recital. Mame filled in with gentle conversation. Neither woman brought up the incident at the store. They tried to let the night pass normally. Bumpy smiled when appropriate, complimented the meal, meatloaf and greens, one of his favorites, and even helped clear the dishes, which made Mamie raise an amused eyebrow. Bumpy rarely did domestic chores unprompted. Perhaps it was his way of apologizing for the distress caused that day, or a way to occupy the nervous energy simmering under his skin. As night fell, Bumpy retreated again to his study to await Bobby. Around 9 p.m., a discreet knock came from the back entrance, a door that opened into an alley behind the apartment building. Bumpy admitted Bobby inside. Bobby was a lanky man with alert eyes, wearing a flat cap and an overcoat. He handed Bumpy a slip of paper with scribbled notes. I did some asking around, made a few calls, Bobby said in a low voice as they both stood by the desk lamp. Mr. Herbert Wilson lives in Queens Kew Gardens, but he often stays late at the store until around 7:00 p.m. to close out the register and inventory on Saturdays. Usually only a janitor is there cleaning floors by that time. No dedicated security guard, apparently. It's a nice neighborhood. They rely on the doorman of the next building and general police patrols. Bumpy nodded, scanning the notes in the yellow lamplight. Address of the store, 0, which he knew. Manager's home address and phone C irrelevant for now. Schedule details. Cameras, he asked. None inside the store proper. From what I found, they use store detectives in daytime to watch for shoplifting. At night, they lock up and go. There's an alarm system, but presumably the manager arms it when he leaves. If we catch him before he sets it, we're good. Bobby shifted. How do you want to play it? Bumpy appreciated the thoroughness. We'll go just before closing. I want to catch him inside, when customers are gone, but before he leaves. I'd prefer to avoid dealing with any bystanders. You drive me and help ensure we don't get surprises. I might need you to keep any janitor or clerk out of my hair. Bobby gave a tight smile. Understood. You want me to bring any of the boys? No. The fewer the better. Will be enough. Bumpy folded the paper and put it in his pocket. He then opened a drawer and took out a small snub-nosed revolver, handing it to Bobby. In case you need it, but only use if absolutely necessary. Quiet and clean is what we're aiming for. The Bobby accepted the firearm and tucked it into his waistband. He'd worked with Bumpy long enough that a night like tomorrow didn't rattle him, but he did feel a certain grim satisfaction. He didn't know the exact insult that sparked this, but if someone offended Miss Mamie or the family, well, justice would be served. Before leaving, Bobby paused. "Boss, one more thing. That store, it's in a white neighborhood. If something goes down, we gotta be extra careful. The cops up there won't look the other way like some of ours do." Bumpy's eyes narrowed slightly. "I know. We go in and out quick. Wilson won't be calling any cops when I'm done. I guarantee he'll keep his mouth shut." His tone held absolute certainty. Bobby didn't doubt it. They agreed on logistics. Tomorrow at 5:45 p.m., Bobby would pick Bumpy up a block from the store to avoid drawing attention to Bumpy's personal car or driver in the area. They would park discreetly and wait for other staff to leave, then make their move. After Bobby left, Bumpy felt a grim calm wash over him. The plan was set. The anticipation of retribution steadied his nerves. He stepped out of the study. The apartment was mostly dark, a single lamp in the living room casting a soft glow. Mamie sat in an armchair under that light, a book open on her lap but her eyes distant. She looked up when she heard him. "Everything all right?" she asked quietly. "Yes," Bumpy responded, equally soft. He crossed the room and gently kissed her good night, an assurance he'd be careful, then went to kiss a sleeping Ruthie on the forehead. Standing over his daughter's bed, watching her sleep peacefully, Bumpy felt any lingering hesitation melt away. This was about her as much as about Mamie. He could still see that hurt in her eyes when Wilson used that word. No, he would not let it go unanswered. The next day, Saturday, dawned cold and bright. Bumpy spent the day handling a few routine matters in Harlem, checking in on one of his small businesses, having lunch at a diner where many in the neighborhood greeted him respectfully. Outwardly, he was the picture of normalcy. Inwardly, every hour that passed brought him closer to the moment he was yearning for. He returned home by mid-afternoon and told Mamie he had some business. That evening, she knew what that euphemism meant this time. She helped him straighten his tie before he left, a subtle gesture of solidarity, and said nothing more on it. Ruthie was at a friend's house for the day, conveniently avoiding any worry about where her father was headed tonight. At 5:30 p.m., Bumpy dressed in a dark overcoat and his fedora, looking every bit the distinguished gentleman. Underneath the coat, holstered at his side, was the revolver. And in a deep pocket, he had placed the old red price tag gun. Its weight against his hip was oddly satisfying. He made his way to the Rendezvous point. True to plan, Bobby's car, a nondescript black Bic, was waiting a block away from the Target store. Bumpy slid into the passenger seat, giving Bobby a silent nod of greeting. The two men then sat in comfortable silence for a while, eyes on the front of the brightly lit department store down the street. Through the large display windows, they could see the waning flow of customers making last-minute purchases. A security guard in uniform was stationed at the door in these final shopping hours, something Bobby hadn't known. But it appeared to be a precaution during business hours. That guard would likely leave once the doors were locked. "Store closes in 10. Bobby noted quietly, glancing at his watch. 5:50 p.m. Bumpy nodded. His heartbeat was steady, almost slow. That pre-action clarity he'd honed over decades of dangerous work was coming over him. He surveyed the street. It was fairly quiet. This was a high-end retail block, which would empty out soon after closing time, especially on a chilly Saturday evening when people would hurry home or off to dinner. At 6:00 on the dot, they watched the uniformed guard usher the last few shoppers out. A couple, carrying glossy shopping bags, walked off down the sidewalk. The guard then pulled the heavy door closed and locked it. He tipped his hat through the glass, likely saying good night to someone inside. Then he himself exited through a side door and started down the street, soon disappearing around the corner. Presumably, his shift was done with the store officially closed. The lights inside the store dimmed slightly as the closing routine began. Now the only people left should be employees. Bumpy tapped the dashboard. "Let's move." Bobby drove the Bic slowly down the street and then around to the alley behind the store. From their briefing, they knew there was a loading bay and service entrance back there for deliveries. The alley was deserted, lit only by one flickering overhead lamp. They parked by the mouth of the alley and proceeded on foot to the service door. At the door, Bumpy tested it gently. Locked. Not surprising. He reached into his pocket and produced a set of lockpicks. Crime boss he might be, but Bumpy hadn't forgotten the tricks from his younger hustler days. He selected a pick and a tension wrench, and in under a minute of fiddling in the cold, there was a soft snick as the service door lock yielded. He eased it open carefully. They stepped into a quiet back storeroom filled with crates and boxes of merchandise. The smell of new clothes and cardboard was strong. A faint radio was playing somewhere deeper in the building, likely the janitor listening to music as he worked. The tune was a scratchy Motown hit, My Guy, by Mary Wells, ironically cheerful in contrast to the deed about to be done. Softly, Bumpy closed the door behind them. He and Bobby moved down a corridor lined with stock shelves. At an intersection, Bumpy held up a hand and peeked. They could see into the main sales floor now, rows of mannequins and displays cast long shadows in the partially dimmed lighting. Toward the front, an older black man in a maintenance uniform was dry, mopping the marble floor, humming along to the radio he had placed on a counter. The janitor, Bumpy thought. Best to avoid him entirely if possible. The man was just doing his job. And Bumpy certainly had no intention of harming a brother from Harlem or anywhere else who hadn't done a thing wrong. At the far opposite end, through an archway that led to offices, faint light glowed. The manager's domain. Bumpy leaned to Bobby's ear, whispering, "Take care of that." He nodded towards the janitor. Bobby understood. While Bumpy stayed back in the shadows, Bobby stepped out into the main floor and approached the janitor silently from behind. In one swift motion, he wrapped an arm around the man's shoulders in a friendly manner, startling him, and pressed the muzzle of the snub, nose revolver to his side. "Don't be alarmed," Bobby whispered quickly and kindly. "We're not here to hurt you. But you gotta go, quietly." The janitor, eyes wide, nearly dropped his mop. He recognized an armed hold when it happened, and though frightened, he nodded vigorously. He was perhaps 60, wary, with creased, world-weary features. "All right." He stammered softly. Bumpy emerged and came up to them, finger to his lips in a shushing gesture. "We have some business with your boss. I suggest you take an early night. Forget you saw anyone." The man, gaze flicking between the two intruders, realized who Bumpy was. Recognition flared in his eyes. Any Harlem native who read the papers or heard street talk knew the face of Bumpy Johnson. The recognition seemed to both surprise and reassure him. Bumpy wasn't known to harm innocents arbitrarily. The janitor gave a quick nod. "Yes, sir. I'll just leave then." Bobby slowly removed the gun and stepped back. The janitor, heart-hammering, set his mop aside and raised his hands slightly to show cooperation. "I didn't see a thing," he murmured. "I'll go out the front side door." Bumpy handed the man a folded 20 bill, a significant sum, pressing it into his palm. In a low voice he said, "For the inconvenience. Have a good night, brother." The janitor swallowed, nodded, and, clutching the bill, hurried off across the floor. They watched as he unlocked a side exit and slipped out into the night, glancing back once at the shadows where Bumpy and Bobby stood. In moments he was gone. The store was now empty except for their target. The radio still played its tune into the emptiness. Bumpy moved to the device and switched it off, plunging the store into a heavier silence. Only a distant, muffled sound of a drawer closing in the office area indicated where the manager was. "He'll know something's off if he comes out," Bobby whispered. "We won't give him the chance." Bumpy replied. He signaled for Bobby to stay a few steps behind as backup. Together, they advanced towards the corridor leading to the manager's office. As they neared the office door, voices became audible. Mr. Wilson was on the phone, talking jovially, oblivious to the men approaching. "Telling you, Marge, these holiday shipments are a nightmare," he was saying, with a chuckle. Yes, I'll be home by 8. Save me some dinner. Love you." A pause. "No, just paperwork. Of course not. Nothing interesting ever happens here." He laughed. Bumpy stopped just outside the door frame, listening. Wilson was wrapping up a personal call, presumably to his wife, before heading out. Bumpy's face was impassive as he heard Wilson's casual tone. Nothing interesting ever happens here. That was about to change. They heard the click of the phone being hung up. Bumpy took that as his cue. He stepped into the doorway, filling it, with Bobby just behind and to the side, gun drawn but kept low and out of immediate sight. Mr. Herbert Wilson was shrugging on his overcoat and humming the same Motown tune that had been on the radio. He had his back to the door as he prepared to leave, taking a moment to lock the drawers of a metal file cabinet in the corner of his spacious office. The office itself was tidy, with a large mahogany desk, a few chairs, and framed photographs of store events on the walls. A single green, shaded banker's lamp cast light on the desk strewn with ledger books. Bumpy observed the man for a second. Wilson moved leisurely, the confidence of someone who thinks his day is done and everything is normal. That arrogance still clung to him, that sense of security within his domain. Bumpy cleared his throat softly. Mr. Wilson. The manager startled violently, nearly dropping his keys. He spun around. His initial annoyance at someone barging in after hours dissolved into shock when he saw who stood there. The color drained from his face. What the hell? He blurted. He recognized Bumpy instantly. He'd spent time the night before convincing himself the black man in the fancy suit was just some nobody. But deep down he'd suspected from that chilling calmness and the deference of the driver that this was someone important. Now, seeing Bumpy's face again, here he understood the gravity of his miscalculation. How did you get in here? The store is closed. Wilson's voice was high and edged with fear. He clutched his overcoat lapels as though it were a shield. Bumpy took 2 casual steps into the office. I let myself in. We need to talk. Wilson's eyes flicked past Bumpy to Bobby lurking behind, then back. The manager's instincts told him this was very, very dangerous. I'm going to call the police, he announced, trying for bravado. He reached towards the phone on his desk with a trembling hand. Before he could touch it, Bumpy moved like lightning. He swept the phone off the desk with one hand, sending it crashing to the floor. At the same time, his other hand gently patted the pocket of his overcoat, where the outline of his revolver was. That would be a mistake, he said quietly. Bobby stepped in and closed the office door behind them with a decisive click. The manager was effectively sealed in with them. Wilson backed up against the file cabinet, hands half raised in surrender. His eyes darted between Bumpy and the phone on the floor, which emitted only a dull tone from its disconnection. Mr. Johnson, he began, voice quivering. He tried a placating smile that came out as a grimace. Look, maybe I was out of line yesterday. If you're here about what I said. You know exactly why I'm here? Bumpy interrupted. He removed his hat slowly and set it on the desk, a deliberate gesture that also revealed the cold fury etched on his face. I gave you the courtesy of walking away yesterday, for the sake of my family. That courtesy has expired. Wilson's throat bobbed as he swallowed. I apologize, he sputtered quickly. I was wrong to speak to your wife and daughter that way. I lost my temper, and I used unforgivable language. I'm sorry. His words tumbled out in a rush, fueled by panic. Bumpy cocked his head, regarding the man. In the enclosed space, with no audience of society to impress, Wilson had shed his pompous persona. Now he was just a frightened man pleading for mercy. Bumpy felt a grim satisfaction, but it wasn't enough. Sorry, he repeated. Yesterday you weren't sorry. Yesterday you were mighty proud of yourself, tossing us out like garbage. The manager's eyes flicked to Bobby, who stood silent as death by the door, arms crossed with the gun visible now in his hand. There was no escape. There were customers. I felt you were disturbing them. Wilson tried a justification and instantly regretted it. Bumpy's expression darkened. He took another step forward. Disturbing them? All we did was try to buy something. The only person who caused a disturbance was you, with your big mouth and your hate. Each word from Bumpy was measured, but the anger underneath made Wilson flinch. Wilson's back hit the cabinet. He had nowhere further to retreat. His hands shook. Please, Mr. Johnson, I realize I was wrong. I can make it up to you. If you still want the fabric, I'll send it to your home free of charge. Or money, I can give you money. However much you lost in time or dignity. At the word dignity, Bumpy let out a short, humorless laugh. "You think you can pay me back for what you did to my family's dignity," he said, and then his voice sharpened. "It's not about money, you fool. It's about respect." Wilson's mouth opened and closed as he struggled for words. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple. "I respect you. I do, sir. I just—" Bumpy's hand lashed out without warning, striking Wilson hard across the face with an open palm. It was shockingly fast and shockingly loud in the small office. Wilson yelped and crumpled sideways, one cheek flaming red from the impact. The force of it knocked Wilson's glasses askew, and he nearly fell. He caught himself on the edge of the desk, breathing hard. The sting and surprise brought tears to his eyes. "Aye!" he cried out, reflexively raising a hand to his cheek. Bumpy flexed his fingers where they'd connected with Wilson's face. "That's for calling my wife trash," he said evenly. "That's the least you're going to feel." Wilson's apology had devolved into whimpering. "Please, I'm so sorry. Please don't hurt me." The man was on the verge of sobbing, all pride gone. Bumpy grabbed one of the chairs in front of the desk, spun it around, and sat down calmly, facing Wilson. The casualness of the gesture belied the menace in his eyes. "Mr. Wilson, do you have a family?" he asked suddenly. The question caught the manager off guard. He hesitated. "Why, yes, a wife, 2 kids. Bumpy nodded thoughtfully. "And how would you feel if someone looked at your wife, or your daughter, and called them garbage? Treated them like they were less than human? Would you be angry?" Wilson wiped sweat off his forehead, the back of his hand still trembling. I would," he admitted in a small voice. Bumpy murmured in assent. "You'd want to protect them. You might even do something rash if someone hurt them like that." "Consider what I'm doing a very measured response. Under the circumstances." Wilson's eyes widened. If this was measured, he feared to imagine an unmeasured one. "I wasn't thinking," he pleaded. "I was wrong. I'll do anything to make it right. Tell me what you want." Bumpy leaned forward, elbows on his knees, fixing Wilson with a piercing stare. "What I want," he said softly, "is for you to understand deep in your soul that you can't ever do what you did and walk away unharmed. I want you to feel in your bones how it feels to be denigrated. Words aren't enough for that, Mr. Wilson. Pain is a better teacher." At that, Wilson began to shake his head frantically, sensing the direction things were heading. No, please," he croaked. Bumpy's gaze drifted over the manager's desk. Paperwork neatly stacked, a nameplate reading, Herbert Wilson, General Manager, a silver letter opener, a stapler, and, there it was, the pricing gun, sitting next to a pile of pricing labels. It was a newer model than the one Bumpy had at home, but similar in function, a handheld device for tagging items. The corner of Bumpy's mouth twitched in what might have been a ghost of a smile. He stood up from the chair and reached over the desk deliberately. Wilson, still pressed to the file cabinet, watched in puzzlement and dread as Bumpy picked up the pricing gun and examined it. "I remember this," Bumpy said, holding up the tool. "Yesterday you had this in hand when we walked in. Tagging some new arrivals, I guess." He turned the gun sideways, inspecting the loaded plastic fasteners that would shoot through a price tag to attach it to clothing. He pulled the trigger once into the air, click, zip, the device shot a tiny plastic tag, which bounced off a nearby wall. Wilson flinched at the unexpected sound, heart hammering. He didn't yet fully grasp what Bumpy intended, but it was scaring him more by the second. Bumpy then rifled through the stack of pricing labels on the desk. These were pre-printed stickers with various prices. He found a roll that had small round red tags reading, Sale 0.01, as a placeholder for items nearly free or needing pricing. Likely they were rarely used, perhaps for a clearance bin. How appropriate, Bumpy murmured, peeling one of those tags off its backing. A penny sale tag, the lowest value possible. He affixed the tiny red sticker to a larger white paper tag used for apparel. Wilson's voice trembled as he spoke, desperate to keep him talking rather than doing. I can't imagine how you must have felt. I regret it truly. If I could take it back." "But you can't," Bumpy said flatly, not looking up as he worked. He clipped the white tag into the price gun's needle mechanism, the red 0.01 sticker stark on its face. "Actions have consequences." At this point, Wilson realized Bumpy's intentions. His eyes locked on the tool in Bumpy's hand, and his tongue suddenly felt dry as sand. "Oh God, no, please," he moaned. He slid sideways along the cabinet, as if trying to inch away, but there was nowhere to go. Bumpy set the pricing gun down for a moment. "Bobby," he said calmly without turning, "come hold him." Bobby stepped forward immediately, holstering his own gun to free his hands. Wilson tried to dart around the desk, perhaps thinking to make a break for the door, but Bobby was faster. He caught the stocky manager by the arm and slammed him face down over the desk. Papers and ledgers scattered to the floor. Wilson struggled, kicking his legs and wriggling, but Bobby pinned him with a forearm to the back of his neck. "No! Let me go!" "Help!" Wilson screamed in panic, but his cries were muffled as Bumpy seized a handful of the man's hair and yanked his head up off the desk. Wilson's voice cut off in a pained gasp. "You should be thankful you still have a tongue to use." Bumpy hissed near Wilson's ear. "Because if you keep yelling, I'll cut it out instead." The deadly seriousness in Bumpy's tone was convincing. Wilson froze, whimpering. Bobby adjusted his grip, using his weight to keep Wilson's torso pressed to the desk. The manager's right arm was twisted up behind him, while his left arm flailed weakly until Bobby trapped that too. Wilson's cheek was flat against the wood, his eyes rolling in terror. Bumpy straightened, retrieving the pricing gun again. He stood next to the writhing man, almost clinically. "Open your mouth," he ordered. Wilson clenched his jaw, instinctively defiant now out of sheer terror, muffling a plea. "Don't do this." Bumpy handed the price gun to Bobby for a moment. With both hands free, Bumpy used one to pinch Wilson's nose firmly shut. The other hand clamped over the man's jaw. Deprived of air, Wilson had to open his mouth to gasp after a few seconds. Bumpy then grabbed the lower jaw and yanked it down further. Wilson gurgled, his tongue visible, thrashing in panic as his airway was restricted by the awkward angle. Bumpy nodded to Bobby. "Give it here?" Bobby placed the price gun back into Bumpy's waiting hand. The manager's eyes saw the device coming now, and he truly realized what was about to happen. He made a hideous, wet sound of terror, half a scream, half a plea, but Bumpy's grip on his jaw held firm. Wilson's mouth was forced wide open. "You have a filthy tongue, Mr. Wilson," Bumpy said, almost conversationally, though his breathing was a little heavier with exertion and adrenaline. "Time to put a price tag on it, since you value people so cheaply." Wilson's muffled cries crescendoed as Bumpy brought the tagging gun forward. The white tag with its red 1T dangled from the device's needle like a morbid pendant. Bumpy positioned it just above Wilson's extended tongue. For a split second, Bumpy made eye contact with the manager, a cold, burning stare meeting eyes full of pure terror. Then he pulled the trigger. "Sick poop!" The sound wasn't loud, but to Wilson it was as deafening as a gunshot. The thick needle of the pricing gun punched through the fleshy midsection of his tongue, driving the tag through and embedding a plastic fastener behind it to hold it in place. Wilson's entire body convulsed. A strangled, gurgling scream erupted from him as the pain registered, blinding, white-hot pain exploding in his mouth. His tongue now had a quarter-sized paper tag stapled through it, dangling out of his mouth like some grotesque price label on an item for sale. Bumpy released Wilson's jaw and nose. Wilson bucked and howled, saliva and blood spurting from his mouth as he tried to scream. The scream came out as a horrible, choking wail, unintelligible, as his tongue, his instrument of speech, was impaled and immobilized. Bobby grimaced at the sight, but held Wilson down firmly. He'd seen violence, but this was something new even to him. It was vicious and intimate and symbolic all at once. Blood flowed from beneath the tag on Wilson's tongue, dribbling onto the desk and the papers below. Wilson thrashed in agony, his eyes bulging, tears streaming down his face. He tried to beg, but the result was only a garbled mess of sounds. Nothing coherent could escape around the obstruction and the pain. Bumpy calmly set the price gun aside on the desk, as if done using a mere office tool. He looked at his handiwork with a detached sternness. The tag fluttered slightly with each ragged breath the manager took. The red 0.01 marking was stark against the white paper, now speckled with drops of red blood. With Wilson effectively pinned and silenced, Bumpy spoke slowly, each word deliberate. 1 cent. That's all your insult is worth. He moved to crouch so that Wilson, through his haze of pain, could see him better. You called my wife trash. You thought my people were worth nothing. Now you are marked with the lowest price there is. Wilson was sobbing, drooling blood. The pain in his tongue was overwhelming every sense. His hands, though restrained, twitched, wanting desperately to yank the object out of his mouth, but he couldn't. He could hardly even breathe without pain. Bumpy went on, voice deadly soft. Every time you speak, if you can still speak after this, you'll remember this lesson. He leaned closer, almost whispering in Wilson's ear, which was bright red and mere inches from his lips. You will never insult a black woman again. You will never look at us as trash again, because now you know what it costs you. The Wilson let out a whimpering sound that might have been, yes, or please, or just a moan. His consciousness hovered at the edge of shock. Bumpy motioned to Bobby, who finally released Wilson's arms and stepped back. Wilson didn't move from the desk. He lay across it, wrecked and sobbing, gripping the edges as he coughed and spat blood. He likely didn't even realize he was free, beyond the immediate suffering. Bumpy straightened up, adjusting his tie and smoothing his coat calmly. A spray of blood dotted his right hand and cuff. He looked almost perplexed by it, as one might be by an ink stain. He found a cloth, the manager's pocket square, that had fallen from his coat and wiped his hand and the sleeve methodically. Behind them, the office was a scene of chaos, scattered papers, the phone on the floor, a few smears of blood. But it was contained here. Out on the sales floor nothing was amiss. If they left now, only Wilson and possibly the janitor would know what transpired. Bumpy picked up his fedora from the desk where he had set it and placed it back on his head, tilting it to a perfect angle. Meanwhile, Wilson had sunk to his knees now, having slid off the desk, and was on all fours on the floor, coughing and sobbing. The tag still hung obscenely from his tongue. One of his own hands now gingerly touched it, shaking as he tried to comprehend how to remove the source of his agony without worsening it. He looked up at Bumpy, a bloody drool on his chin, eyes wide with a mixture of supplication and horror. The look clearly begged, "Have mercy." Bumpy regarded him for a moment in silence. In that moment, the manager truly saw Bumpy not just as the man he'd insulted, but as a force, a man who could stride into his life and dismantle it with cold precision. Bumpy Johnson was in his mid-50s, with graying hair at the temples, but he had never looked more dangerous to Wilson than he did now, standing above him like a judge pronouncing sentence. But Bumpy had already delivered the sentence. There was nothing more to say. Instead, he delivered a final warning. If you ever breathe a word about who did this, I'll know. And next time, I won't stop with the tongue. Bumpy's voice was low and even, each syllable punching through the air to embed itself in Wilson's mind. Next time, I'll price, tag your heart. Wilson shook his head frantically, a garbled attempt at, I won't, spilling from his bloodied mouth. Satisfied, Bumpy turned to Bobby. We're done here. Bobby, who had been quietly watching the door and the street beyond through a crack in the blinds to ensure no interruption, nodded. He opened the office door, and after a quick peek to confirm the coast was clear, motioned for Bumpy to exit. As Bumpy stepped over the threshold, he paused and looked back at the pitiful figure of the manager on the floor. Clean yourself up, Bumpy said with a cold sort of pity. You're a mess. With that, he left the office. Bobby followed, pulling the door shut, leaving Mr. Chet, Herbert Wilson crawling on the floor of his once immaculate office, choking on pain and regret. They retraced their path through the quiet store. The silence was broken only by the muffled sounds of Wilson's sobbing from the office behind them. In the main area, everything was as they left it. The side door the janitor had gone out was closed and presumably locked from outside. They went back the way they came, through the stockroom to the service entrance. Bumpy locked the service door behind them with the same picks, wiping it down with his handkerchief to remove any fingerprints. The alley was empty and silent under the night sky. A few snow flurries had begun to drift down, speckling their coat shoulders with white. The two men walked back to Bobby's book parked at the alley's mouth. They got in casually. Bobby started the engine and drove off at a normal pace, neither fast nor slow. Just two men driving on a Saturday evening. Inside the car, Bobby exhaled the breath he'd been half holding. Christ, he muttered, shaking his head in a mix of adrenaline and astonishment at what had just happened. Bumpy was quiet, looking out the window. They passed under a streetlight, its glow sliding across his impassive face. After a moment, he responded, voice calms. Hail live. Bobby glanced at Bumpy's hands. You're bleeding, boss. Bumpy looked down. In his focus on Wilson, he hadn't noticed a small cut on the back of his left hand. Perhaps a ring on Wilson's finger had scratched him during the struggle. It oozed a thin line of blood. It's nothing, Bumpy said, wiping it with his handkerchief. They drove uptown towards Harlem. Bobby took a circuitous route to ensure they weren't being followed, though it was highly unlikely anyone had caught on to their presence at the store. It was second nature to be cautious. Think he's going to keep quiet? Bobby asked eventually. Oh, he will, Bumpy replied with absolute confidence. He's too ashamed and scared to do otherwise. He won't want to admit a black man got the better of him, and he definitely won't want me coming back. Bobby nodded, satisfied. Hell of a thing you did to him. Bumpy didn't respond immediately. He flexed the fingers of his right hand, remembering the feel of the trigger and the resistance when it went through flesh. It was a nasty act, to be sure. But as he thought of that hateful word the man used, of the tear on Ruthie's cheek, Bumpy felt no remorse. The man had earned every ounce of that pain. It was fitting, Bumpy finally said. He put a price on us with his words. I put a price on him for real. Bobby gave a low whistle. Message received, I'd say. They fell into silence. The car crossed 110th Street, the unofficial border where Harlem began. It always comforted Bumpy, returning to the streets where he was a king rather than an interloper. Here, cops still watched him and enemies could still plot, but at least he felt home, surrounded by his people. Back at the department store, Mr. Wilson managed, after long minutes of agony, to get the tag out of his tongue. In the privacy of his office, he had collapsed against the desk and with shaking hands and a cry of pain yanked the plastic anchor out, tearing his tongue further. Blood poured anew, and he nearly fainted. It took him another half hour to muster the strength to stumble to the phone, which he had to piece back together since the base had separated from the cord. He dialed his wife, not 911M. When she answered, he tried to speak but mostly babbled and moaned. Alarmed, she hung up and called an ambulance, giving them the store address from the caller ID he'd rung from. Paramedics found him barely conscious on the office floor in a pool of blood. They initially thought he'd been shot or stabbed in the mouth, but upon closer look realized the wound was a puncture through the tongue. It was such a bizarre injury that the police who arrived were baffled. In the hospital, after stitches in his tongue and doses of antibiotics and painkillers, Wilson was interrogated by officers. Talking was extremely painful, his tongue was swollen and lisping. Still, they pressed, "Who did this? What happened?" Wilson, eyes downcast and haunted, shook his head. With the mangled tongue, he mumbled a story about robbers breaking in, 2 men, maybe they thought he had cash. Did they say anything? Did you recognize them? The detective asked. Wilson hesitated. He remembered every single word Bumpy had said, every second of the torture. He also remembered that finger tracing along his lips and the promise of his heart being tagged next. He shook his head adamantly. No, he didn't see. It was dark. They said nothing. He lied in a slurred voice. The police were frustrated. A brutal assault like this in a nice part of town. It would normally be a sensational story. But with no suspects and the victim not cooperating, what could they do? One younger officer remarked later to a colleague that the victim's wounds and silence reminded him of mafia retributions he'd heard of, but what mafia stakes did a department store have? It didn't add up, and Wilson wouldn't elaborate. The manager's wife and children visited him the next day, horrified. He could barely explain to them that he'd been attacked at work. He certainly didn't share why. How could he? Admitting that he'd used vile language, and that a gangster had exacted revenge would only scare them and tarnish his own image further. He told them it must have been burglars, and left it at that. Within a week, Herbert Wilson quietly resigned from his position at the store, citing health reasons. He left New York entirely for a while, recuperating at a relative's home in Connecticut. His mouth healed slowly, but some nerve damage left his speech slightly thick for life, a permanent reminder, whenever he spoke that his tongue had paid a price. Meanwhile, back in Harlem, Bumpy Johnson's life moved on as normal as his life could be. The next morning after the incident, he woke early. It was Sunday, a day he often spent quietly at home or going to early service at Abyssinian Baptist to please Mamie. Downstairs in the kitchen, Bumpy found Mamie already up, reading the newspaper at the table with a cup of coffee. She looked up when he entered. There was a question in her eyes, but also relief seeing him safe and sound. "Coffee's hot," was all she said. "Sounds good." Bumpy poured a cup and sat across from her. He was dressed casually in slacks and a cardigan now, a contrast to the avenging figure of last night. Mamie carefully folded the paper. "No news, I take it," she said. By news, she meant any trouble from what he'd done. Bumpy sipped the coffee. "No. And I don't expect any." He added a spoonful of sugar, stirring slowly. The spoon's quiet clink against the porcelain was the only sound for a moment. Mamie reached across and laid her hand atop his, stopping the stirring. He met her gaze. She spoke softly. "Did you? Was it terribly violent?" Bumpy turned his hand to hold hers. "He's alive," he assured. "He won't be bothering anyone. Or talking." A small, grim smile touched Mamie's lips. "You scared him good then." Bumpy simply nodded. He knew Mamie didn't need or want the gory details. She just needed to know it was handled and that he was safe. Just then, Ruthie's footsteps padded into the kitchen. She was still in her robe, hair a bit messy from sleep. "Good morning," she mumbled. "Morning, sweetheart," Mamie greeted, releasing Bumpy's hand and giving Ruthie a bright smile. "Want some oatmeal?" "I was about to make some." Ruthie shrugged. "Maybe with brown sugar, please." She sat down next to Bumpy. "Hi, Daddy." Bumpy smiled warmly at her. "Morning, Pumpkin. Sleep all right?" She nodded. As Mamie moved to the stove to fix breakfast, Ruthie leaned her head on her father's shoulder. "Daddy, about yesterday." Bumpy felt a pang. He braced internally for her to ask something pointed. "Yes." "That man, Mr. Wilson," she said slowly. "He was so mean. People like that, they won't change." "Will they?" There was bitterness beyond her years in her tone. Bumpy gently put an arm around her. "I think some people can change, but some learn only by being taught a lesson." Ruthie looked up at him, perhaps catching something in his voice. "Did you teach him a lesson?" Bumpy paused. He glanced at Mamie by the stove. She was stirring the pot and listening quietly, letting him handle it. He then looked back to his daughter's expectant eyes. "Yes," he said softly. "I did." Ruthie processed that. She didn't ask how. Maybe she didn't want to know the details. She just nodded and snuggled against him. "Good," she said simply. He deserved it. Bumpy hugged her a little tighter, a mix of pride and concern swirling in him. Pride that she understood self-respect. Concern that she was already old enough to accept vigilante justice as necessary in a world stacked against them. He kissed the top of her head. "No one is ever going to talk to you or your mother like that again, not while I'm around. That's a promise." Ruthie closed her eyes, relieved. She believed him absolutely. In her world, her daddy could do anything, protect against anyone. Mamie turned off the stove and brought over bowls of steaming oatmeal. She set them down and bent to kiss Bumpy on the cheek lightly, a thank you unspoken in the gesture. Then she kissed Ruthie's forehead. "All right, eat up, both of you." As they ate, the conversation turned to simpler things, church service times, the school recital next week, whether it might snow more heavily later. The ugliness of the previous day seemed to melt away in the warmth of their home. Yet, not entirely. Because within that home, and indeed within the community, stories have a way of finding life. By Monday, an amusing and shocking whisper made its way through certain circles in Harlem. "Bumpy stapled a white man's tongue!" The story grew in the telling. Some said the guy had insulted Bumpy's wife at a downtown restaurant. Others correctly said it was a store. The core truth remained: someone disrespected Mrs. Johnson, and Bumpy responded in a fashion so extreme that it instantly became legend. At an uptown barber shop, men chuckled in admiration, one saying, "He tagged that cracker like he was a piece of cheap meat, man!" Ha! Bet that fool won't talk back again. At a Harlem ladies' luncheon, one of Mamie's friends delicately probed, "Darling, I heard that your husband took care of that horrible man from the store. Word is he won't be wagging his tongue at any other women." Mamie had simply smiled demurely and said, "People shouldn't believe everything they hear, neither confirming nor denying." But the twinkle in her eye told them enough. Even some law enforcement members up in Harlem got wind of it. An old black patrolman, who'd walked the beat for years and knew the community, reportedly laughed and said, "Serve the bastard right. Bumpy did what we all wish we could do sometimes." He, of course, kept such comments far from his white colleagues. The incident soon took on a moral meaning in the Harlem community. It wasn't just seen as gangster brutality, it was seen as standing up to racism. Many black residents, who swallowed daily indignities because they didn't have the power or position to fight back, felt a vicarious thrill. Bumpy Johnson, whatever his criminal deeds, had shown that a black man's family demanded respect and would be avenged if wronged. It was as if Bumpy was a dark folk hero. He broke the law, but in service of a kind of justice that the law itself often failed to provide them. For Bumpy, life continued with its usual complexities, managing territory, negotiating with the Italians, keeping ahead of the law. But he did notice in the weeks after that, whenever he or Mamie went downtown, a curious thing happened. Store managers and waiters went out of their way to be courteous. Perhaps word had spread quietly among certain circles, an informal warning: Harlem's crime boss doesn't play around. Treat him and his with respect, or face dire consequences. One afternoon near Christmas, Bumpy and Mamie did stroll down Fifth Avenue, marveling at the holiday displays. They passed by the very department store where the incident occurred. The window was decorated with mechanical elves and reindeer. Bumpy saw a reflection overlay of himself and Mamie on that window, a well-dressed black couple out for a holiday shopping trip, and behind it the ghost of a memory. Wilson's face contorted in pain. He felt Mamie squeeze his arm, drawing him away. "Come on, Ellsworth," she said. "Let's get a hot chocolate." As they walked on, Bumpy realized he felt lighter. That lingering bitterness from the insult had lifted once he'd answered it. Mamie looked up at him with a gentle smile. There was unspoken gratitude in her eyes. She didn't condone violence, but she cherished the fact that her husband defended her honor fearlessly. Bumpy winked at her, tipping his hat playfully. "Anything for you, dear," he said. It earned him a soft chuckle and a kiss on the cheek. In the following years, Bumpy remained the de facto protector of Harlem's pride in many ways. In 1965, when the police harassment in the neighborhood was out of control, Bumpy himself staged a bold sit in at the 28th Precinct House, demanding fair treatment. The newspapers covered that underworld figure protests discrimination. Some sneered, not understanding the contradictions of a man who broke laws but demanded justice for his people. But Harlem understood. Bumpy's life was a tapestry of contradictions, violence and gentleness, criminality and community service, vengeance and principle. The price tag on the tongue, story stayed largely in the realm of oral history rather than official record. It was too bizarre and too grim to ever be reported formally, especially with no police complaint of substance. But it endured in the memory of those who told it. It became one of those cautionary tales that fathers would secretly share with sons. Don't you ever mistreat a black woman. You know what happened to that store man who did Bumpy Johnson fixed him good. Even outside Harlem, in the organized crime world, the anecdote spread in whispers, often with humorous exaggeration. Some Italian mobsters chuckled about how Bumpy was crazy enough to staple a guy's tongue. But underlying the laughter was respect. They knew Bumpy was not a man to cross, personally or professionally. If he'd go to such lengths over an insult, one shuddered to think what he'd do over true betrayal or harm. In January 1968, about 3 years after the store incident, Bumpy sat at Wells' restaurant, his favorite eating spot, enjoying a quiet, early morning meal. That's when he suffered the massive heart attack that killed him. As he collapsed, clutching his chest, the coffee cup toppled, and the plate of chicken leg and grits spilled. In those final moments, perhaps 100 thoughts could have flashed through his mind. We'll never know. But one imagines that among the reflections of his life, the streets won and lost, the friends and foes, the deals and the gunfights, he might have also thought of Mamie and Ruthie, and known that he always kept them safe and respected. If he had regrets, standing up for his family was not one of them. Bumpy's funeral was a grand affair. Hundreds turned out to St. Martin's Church to pay respects, celebrities, politicians, ordinary Harlem folks. The police were so wary of the crowd and Bumpy's legacy that they had officers on nearby roofs with rifles, as if expecting an uprising from beyond the grave. It was unnecessary, of course. Bumpy was laid to rest quietly, but the turnout showed how deeply he had influenced his community. After the service, Mamie Johnson stood by the grave and held Ruthie's hand. They listened to the final prayers and the soft sobbing of mourners. Among the condolences offered, a notable one came from an elegantly dressed white woman with a veiled hat who approached Mamie. She was the wife of a prominent New York businessman. In a low voice, she said, "Mrs. Johnson, your husband once helped teach a lesson to someone who wronged people like us. I just wanted to pay my respects. He was a formidable man." Mamie was taken aback for a moment, but she realized this lady likely referred to the store incident or a similar story. She simply nodded graciously. "Thank you." He believed in respect above all. The woman glanced at Ruthie and then back to Mamie, choosing her words carefully. It's men like him who make certain others think twice before acting on their worst impulses. With that cryptic comment, the woman departed. Mamie later learned she was a friend of a black woman who worked at that department store, a chain of connections through which the story had evidently flowed even into elite circles. As the grave was filled, Mamie held Ruthie and allowed herself a bittersweet smile amid tears. Bumpy's life had been turbulent, often dangerous. But he had also been, in his own way, a force that shielded Harlem. He had left a legacy that people would talk about for generations in whispers of awe or laughter or disbelief. One of those legacy stories, without doubt, would be about the store manager and the stapled tongue. It was too outrageous and symbolic to ever be forgotten entirely. In barbershops, on stoops, in late night bull sessions, the tale would be told. There was a white store manager who called Bumpy's wife a trash, and Bumpy, he took a price tag gun and stapled a 1-cent tag to that man's tongue. True story. And as the listener's eyes would widen and a slow grin of satisfaction spread, the teller would conclude with the moral. Don't ever disrespect a black woman, especially not Bumpy Johnson's. He'll make you pay the price, literally. In the end, what Bumpy did in that store wasn't just vengeance, it was a declaration. In a world where black people were told they were worth less, Bumpy turned the tables on one arrogant soul and put the price of his prejudice on full display. 1 cent on the tongue, a dramatic punctuation to a lesson in respect. So the next time someone thinks to spit venomous words at those whom society has historically oppressed, perhaps they'll hesitate, remembering stories like this. Perhaps they'll wonder if somewhere out there is another Bumpy Johnson, ready to balance the scales with Old Testament ferocity. Harlem didn't condone everything Bumpy did, but Harlem sure as hell loved that he did this. Because in that singular act of retribution, he expressed the bottled-up rage and demand for dignity of a whole community. He made it clear, we are not your trash. And for one terrified store manager, and all who heard the tale, that message was stapled in memory as unforgettably as that price tag had been stapled to flesh.